We're working on page 3 of the prerequisites practice test, and we had just begun on 10B. So we decided to use point slope form on this one for no apparent reason. I could have used y equals mx plus b just because, like I said, I want to make sure you're exposed to both. So this was my m, my x1, my y1, so I plugged those in. Y minus -3 equals -4/5 times x minus 6. Change the double negative to positive. We were just doing the calculator part of the next piece, so y plus 3 equals -4/5 x. So let's go ahead and plug that in, and that's what we got, -4/5 times -6. Notice they're both negative, so don't forget to plug that in when you type them in the calculator, and that gave us a positive 4 4/5. So we were just one step away from being done. We need our y alone because the question asked us to put all of our answers in slope-intercept form, which means y equals mx plus b. So whether we use that formula or not, they still want the answers in that form. So subtract 3 from the left, subtract 3 from the right, and we get y equals -4/5 x. 4 minus 3 is positive 1 4/5. Or if you prefer to use the calculator, which you probably don't need, but -3 equals 1 4/5. Just what we wrote. And your calculator may default to improper, so if you have -4/5 x plus 9/5, that would be fine too. Just make sure you check when you're doing an electronic test like Alex. Just make sure, does it say leave all answers as fractions, or does it say leave answers as mixed numbers? If it doesn't say anything, that means you could write 9/5 or 1 4/5. But if it specifies, you have to make sure and do the way they said. And I showed you before how to do that on your calculator. This says mixed number to fraction. So because it's in blue, it has to be preceded by second. And then you hit your fraction key and enter, and that would change it. So if it said leave all your answers as fractions, a mixed number is not a fraction, so you would need to do that step. But if it doesn't say anything, you can leave it either way. Okay. We wouldn't leave it as a decimal because the rule is don't mingle decimals and fractions in the same problem. They should be consistent. So if you have a fraction here, you should have a fraction there, and we'd never write our slope as a decimal because then we wouldn't have our rise over run. So either both fraction and mixed number or fraction, improper fraction, but keep them in the same form. Don't mix units. Okay, so now we're ready for 10C. This one, I notice, did not give us a slope. The first one gave us a slope. The second one gave us a slope. This one doesn't, so that's my hint. Boom, jump in and find your slope. Just make sure you don't stop after that. Do you know how many students stop after finding slope? The directions say write the equation of the line. So I can't stop after finding slope. The only time I would do that is if it said, like on page 2, find the slope. Then you'd stop. But this one wants the line. So second y minus the first y over second x minus the first x, -2. So we have a couple double negatives. So -4 minus -1, 3 minus -2. So make those both plus before you do anything further, and then evaluate. So -4 plus 1 is -3, and 3 plus 2 is +5. So that's just my first piece of the puzzle. Now I need to write the equation. We'll go ahead and use this formula again. And then on the next one, we can go back to y equals mx plus b. So we have a couple of each. But if it didn't specify and you wanted to use y equals mx plus b on this one, that's fine. So let's see, which point has the least number of negatives? This one. So I'm going to pick this as my x1 and my y1. So this would be y minus -4 equals m -3/5 times x minus 3. And remember what I said in class, it doesn't matter which point you pick. If you pick that one, we'll end up with the same answer at the end after we do all the distributing and stuff. We, excuse me, we get the same answer. So don't worry, oh, did I pick the wrong point? There is no wrong point. I just don't like to work with negatives because I know students miss negatives a lot. So if I can pick a point with fewer negatives, I'll do that. So my double negative turned into positive. So we now have y plus 4. And we're going to distribute. So -3/5 times x is -3/5 x. I can see the next one's going to be positive, a negative times the negative. So I'll put that plus sign there and then I'll go to the calculator. So let's move the paper over a little bit so we can get the calculator screen in. So we're going to be typing -3 fraction bar 5 times -3. Forgot my arrow there. Let's go ahead and put that in. So times -3. So double negative is indeed positive. So your calculator should either give you 1 4/5 or 9/5, depending on what is the default. And then last, we subtract 4 from both sides. So -4 minus 4. So y equals -3/5 x. And in our calculator, we have 1 4/5 already stored there. So just do -4. And we get -2 1/5 or -11/5. Either way, whichever form your calculator gives you. So since mine gives the mixed number, I'm going to write it. But just know it's the same thing. And remember, you can test it. So let's say you get this and you look at the answer key and you go, oh, that's not what she has. All you have to do is do second fraction and you can see that is what I have, -11/5. So it doesn't matter which form you give it in. So -2 1/5 or -11/5, same thing. Okay, now we're on perpendicular, so you have to remember all the things about perpendicular. Perpendicular means the slopes are what? Two things. Opposites and reciprocals. I'm trying to get my paper straight here. Okay, so if they're opposites and reciprocals, what slope am I going to use? Opposite of plus, minus, reciprocal 2. So perpendicular tells me to change the sign and reciprocate. So let's go ahead and use y equals mx plus b since we want to do 2 of each one just to practice. So obviously we have our m. This is going to be our x. This is going to be our y. So in place of y, we write 5 equals, in place of m, -2, in place of x, -2, and then plus b. So this is 5 equals negative times the negative, +4 plus b. And I told you I like my b on the left, so I'm going to move it over, not move it, but flip the equation. So just flip it over. So b plus 4 equals 5. So I can see b is 1. So now in place of m, I'm going to put negative 2 for my final answer. And in place of b, I'm going to put 1. So we're going to get y equals negative 2x plus 1. So super easy, but I'll tell you, most students miss it right there. They make that just negative and don't flip it, or they flip it and they forget to change a sign. So you just have to remember 2 things. Flip, change the sign. And then it's easy from there. Okay, let's move on to page 4. Last 2 problems from section 2.7. So for the function g of x equals negative x squared minus 5x plus 12, find the function values. So we learned that this means replace x with 2, because whatever's in parentheses is always our x, and you can see up there. So replace x with 2. And so many students miss this because they write it incorrectly. So it's out to the side, and on the paper pencil test, I make students write this, and I'll be collecting your work on the electronic test too, so make sure you write this step. So there's a negative, then I put my 2 in, then the squared minus 5 times 2 plus 12. So notice I didn't use parentheses on this because I'm inputting a positive value. Next step, I'm inputting a negative, so then yes, I will use parentheses. But when I'm inputting a positive value, no parentheses are needed. So I just took each x out and replaced it with 2. Negative 2 squared minus 5 times 2 plus 12. After this, you're allowed to use your calculator, but this step gets graded, so make sure you write it correctly. So to put it in our calculator, we type it just like we see it, and that's why it's so important to write it correctly. Then you'll put it in your calculator correctly. So type in your negative, type in your 2, hit your x squared button, then do subtraction, and then do 5 times 2, and then do plus 12. And that gives us negative 2. And I also want to do it by hand because a lot of students don't do this correctly. And remember how I said in 150, some of the problems are going to have to be done by hand. They have non-calculator tests. So when you're doing this, you do 2 times 2, 4, and add a negative. This does not mean negative 2 times negative 2. Exponents come first, so you do 2 times 2, 4, then bring down your negative. So it would have to have parentheses in order for you to do negative 2 times negative 2, but there's no parentheses because that's positive. Negative 5 times 2, negative 10 plus 12. So negative 14 plus 12 you can see is negative 2. So you should be able to do that both ways. Like I said in here, yes, you can use your calculator, but maybe in the next class you won't be able to. Okay, next we have g of negative 4. This time we're inputting a negative, and here's where you got to be careful. There's a negative out front, then I'm inputting a negative, and then I have my squared minus 5, input negative 4 plus 12. So that is the points for writing it correctly. So the minus, input a negative 4 squared, minus 5. So let's type that in and see what we get. So minus, then type a parenthesis, negative 4, close, hit your squared, subtraction, 5, parentheses, negative 4, close, plus 12, and we get 16. So g of -4 equals 16.